Hello everyone, my name is Phawx. In this video, we're going to be reviewing the OneDock eGPU solution. This thing is super wild. This may very well be the smallest eGPU solution that I'm aware of. There are a few things that we need to talk about here and a few discoveries that happened when I was reviewing this device. There are a lot of really good things to talk about, but there are some a little concessions to be made and talked about, but there are plans to solve those. So this is without a doubt one of the sexiest ways to have an eGPU solution. Having this just on my desk, I could just use it as decoration itself. Plus, because this wiring is so tight here, it just looks super neat. The other thing that's wild about this is that it supports Oculink, and this is something that I've been raving about a lot lately, but it also supports Thunderbolt, and this also supports daisy chaining. The one thing to note here is that this Thunderbolt solution is the most compatible out of all the Thunderbolt solutions that I have. I used a Razer Chroma eGPU, which failed on most of the GPD stuff that I had. I went over to Sonnet's eGPU, and that was the only eGPU solution that worked on GPD's Thunderbolt solution. And that Sonnet eGPU also worked on my WinMax 2. However, it did not work on my iNeo 2 or my Win 4. However, this does work on my iNeo 2 and my Win 4 and my WinMax 2. So if you were looking for a Thunderbolt solution, this is excellent. I've had better compatibility with this than I have had with Sonnet. My Sonnet was already my best because my Razer didn't work at all. So as far as I'm concerned, this is a winner if you were looking for just an eGPU solution, a Thunderbolt eGPU solution. But it does support Oculink as well. So it basically covers all your bases and is a fantastic eGPU solution that is just beautiful to look at, great for the desktop. I'm a big fan of it. Now, obviously, it's super tiny, so it's missing a core component. That is this mammoth jammer right here. This is a 450 watt power supply. The problem here is that just with this one alone and me using a 3090 really highlighted one of the problems with the OneDock itself. Now, there are solutions to this where it looks like there's going to be an adapter to the OneDock that will plug in power directly to the GPU, and they can have a separate power to power the OneDock itself. And this way you're powering the GPU separately. The problem with the 3090 is that on this particular thing, on this particular power supply, when it's powering both the OneDock and the GPU itself, if there's power surges, which the 3090 does have, what happens is that the GPU just disconnects for just a brief moment, but that brief moment is just enough where it'll disconnect from the host machine. In this case, my GPD WinMax 2, the 6800U version. So I had to make some concessions on Thunderbolt because Thunderbolt is also powering the host machine, in this case, the GPD WinMax 2. I have my GPD WinMax 2 set to 35 watt, which means that it's actually consuming around 50 watt, 55 watt, which has to be power supplied from this through Thunderbolt to my device, as well as powering the GPU. The end result being is that I wanted in this particular video to show 3090 performance on desktop versus Oculink and Thunderbolt. The reality was that because of the power spikes that happen on the 3090 is that I could only get stable performance on Oculink at 250 watts. So I had to undervolt a bit and lower the power limit just a bit. I was at 85% and also undervolting, which once we take a look at the benchmarks, you can see that we're actually pretty close. So the power differences might just be negligible at that. However, for Thunderbolt to get any type of stability, I had to lower it down to 200 watts. And that's something where it's not really fair to really compare the two at that point, because the only reason I'm saying this is that if you were looking to use the OneDock with a very high-end GPU, that you should look at getting in a tertiary power supply for the GPU itself. If you were looking to use the OneDock and using something like a 3070 or a GPU that only is going to take up to 250 watts, there's nothing that you're going to really have to worry about. So that's the caveat that I wanted to mention here about the OneDock itself. The other negative about the OneDock, and he sent me additional fans as well, but the default fans that are in the OneDock are pretty loud. So that's probably the only thing that I would say that's actually a negative about the OneDock overall, because you can compensate by getting a different GPU with the power supply or getting a tertiary power supply to power a bigger GPU. But the fans themselves are always going to be there, and I didn't try the other fans that he had supplied. So that's one thing that I would wish that would get worked on a little bit more, is trying to figure out how to make it a little bit more quieter. So that's the only thing that I want to say as like caveats and negatives about the device. I love the device as it is. It does what it does in a very sexy package and has excellent Thunderbolt support and Oculink support. So let's go ahead and take a look at one benchmark where I did manage to, after a lot of testing, successfully managed to get 250 watt power on the Thunderbolt solution. I have to edit this real quick. I need to put this in before we start talking about benchmarks, just so that we're all understood on what's going on here. I had a desktop with an AMD 5900X running Windows 11 22H2. I had a 3090 in there. We're running the NVIDIA drivers of 531.68. On my GPU Max 2, I am running the same system, so Windows 11 22H2, same driver set. I am running the TDP on my GPU Max 2 at 35 watt, EPP set to 0, so I'm basically making sure that all power goes to CPU and nothing else. But I'm running at 35 watt for these tests, and that's just to get a baseline understanding of what's going on in these tests. So what we're looking at here, this is Batman Arkham Knight. This is 4K max settings, including like Nvidiaworks and all that other stuff. And when we take a look at this, you can see that my desktop is able to pull ahead in averages, but if we take a look at 1% lows and 0.2% lows, you can see that they're pretty much in line. In fact, if we take a look at the 1 percentile of the Oculink, we're basically in line with my desktop, and only Thunderbolt is about 10% slower. This is where the difference between Thunderbolt and Oculink really is felt more than anything, is these 1% lows. And that gets a little bit more exaggerated as we go down to lower resolutions when we get more CPU bound. However, when we take a look at these 1080p tests, this is where we can start to see large differences. Now, the averages on my desktop on the 5900X, now remember that my desktop can upclock like crazy because I have a giant heatsink on there, and I'm able to wick away all that heat because my CPUs are going over 100 watts themselves easily. Whereas I'm limited to 35 watt on the 6800U for both Oculink and Thunderbolt. But when we take a look at the 1% lows of Thunderbolt on the 6800U, that's where things really start becoming really apparent. The 1% lows on Oculink on my 6800U is basically 50% better. And if we take a look at it against desktop, it's 83% better. And this is where a lot of the differences between Thunderbolt and Oculink really start being felt, and why I typically prefer Oculink overall. If we were to look at the 1%, if we were to take a look at the 1 percentile lows as a baseline for Oculink, we can see that we're about 25% behind my desktop, where at a 1080p setting where we're getting more in CPU bound, that's really not that bad from the advantage that my desktop has versus my laptop running at 35 watts. So this is pretty huge. We're going to go ahead and move over to Cyberpunk here. I will briefly show you some tests. Let me get that set up for you. Okay, so what we're looking at here is 4K native resolution, no upscaling whatsoever, no ray tracing whatsoever, psycho settings on Cyberpunk 2077. This is one example. Now I'm showing the Thunderbolt score right here. This score, now there's a lot of people that may be aware, I have already done on NVIDIA's Profile Inspector tool, I have already disabled rebar on Thunderbolt. The difference here being is that I had to lower power down on Thunderbolt to actually get it into a stable setting. This is the same thing I was saying earlier, that 200 watts is really like the max if you're going to be running Thunderbolt on a power supply, on a single power supply like this. And 250 watts is really going to be the max when you're doing Oculink, because Thunderbolt, we're going to be sending power to the host, where Oculink, we do not. So that's the only thing I wanted to mention. We're going to go ahead and remove the Thunderbolt's results here, because we're not going to be talking about that. We're only be talking about desktop 5900X versus 6800U Oculink. At 4K settings, this is actually pretty impressive. Now, again, remember, I am undervolting and having a power limit of 250 watts on Oculink, but having said that, I'm still reasonably in line with what I'm able to accomplish versus my desktop. Now, my desktop, the CPU really isn't doing much here. I mean, these frame rates are stupid low. So it's really just how much my GPU is able to accomplish. And with Oculink, I'm basically doing as well as my desktop could possibly do. So this is, again, a great showing from Oculink. Let's go ahead and take a look at 1080p settings. All right, so now when we go into 1080p settings, this is where you're going to start seeing the CPU on the 5900X running away. And as we start climbing into higher frame rate territory, this is where the CPU boundness is going to be falling behind. My laptop, my 1600U is going to start falling behind. If we take a look at 1% lows as a baseline, the 1% lows on desktop is around 41% better. Again, because of CPU wise. If we take a look at my averages, it's only about 5% better, but largely what you're really going to start feeling this is in those 1% lows. And that's where the description feels, where having a really fast desktop CPU is really beneficial when we're trying to push for very high frame rates. All right, up next, we're going to be taking a look at Deus Ex Mankind Divided. The reason why I like looking at this particular game, also Assassin's Creed Origins. These two games are what I consider to be DirectX 11 hard games. These were the last generation of DirectX 11 games that didn't feature any resolution scaling whatsoever. These were pushing the boundaries of where DirectX 11 could go. These are games that are very hard to run on very low power machines. So that's kind of why I always like to show this off. We're taking a look at ultra settings here. This is 4K settings. So 4K resolution, ultra settings preset for Deus Ex Mankind Divided using the DirectX 11 backend. And if we take a look there, if we take a look at our averages, we're getting around 10% better on desktop and around 15% better on 1% lows. This is, again, where we're going to really start seeing, and this is generally the truth, even when we scale up further. I have a 4090. Technically, what I'm doing right now, what I'm streaming with right now, I have my 4090 connected via Oculink to my WinMax 2 6800U, which is what I'm recording on right now and I'm going to be editing on. I've gotten rid of my desktop at this point. So everything you see here is happening via Oculink and my laptop. But yeah, just getting back to that thought, Oculink, generally speaking, from what I found, even with a 4090 and when we can power it correctly with an external GPU, is basically 10% less of the performance that it would be from just full bandwidth. These are in very GPU-bound stress tests. As we start going to lower resolutions or lowering settings where we make it more CPU-bound, this is where the difference between desktop CPUs and laptop CPUs is going to be more profound, only because more of a power problem, right? Because I'm basically doing Zen 3 versus Zen 3 at this point, and the only difference being how much power I can put into the system. So we take a look at this 1080p test for Deus Ex Mankind Divided. Still ultra settings, you can see that the desktop is just pulling ahead a bunch here. And if we take a look at 1% lows here, you can see that my desktop is around 50% better. So if you were to take in the mindset of maybe not today, right now I'm happy being on my 6800U, but very soon I'm going to have a 7840U with Zen 4 CPU cores that has Oculink on the back of it. And that is basically a gigantic CPU upgrade for me. And I'll be able to catch up to my 5900X a little bit easier in this manner. So, I mean, this is going to be pretty much par for the course as we start going into more a CPU-bound territory. All right, next up, this is Doom Eternal. I am using Ultra Nightmare settings. RT is on, so ray tracing is on these tests. However, I am using no upscaling, so this is native 4K that you're looking at right here. And when we take a look at this, when we start looking at, very GPU-bound situations, you can see how well Oculink holds up here. So even on averages, we're looking at 7% better on my desktop, 10% better for 1% lows, and 10% better for 0.2 percentile. So this is, again, once we start really pushing more GPU bound wise, there's less of an impact here. And then we only see the impact difference when we start making things CPU bound. I've been saying this a ton here. Let's bring up the 1080p benches. Oh, right. And here are the 1080p settings. Now, obviously, we're already in like stupid high frame rate anyway. So even at 1080p, I mean, even on the display that I have, 120 FPS would be fine. I can hit that no problem whatsoever. And on 1 percentile, I'm hitting 140 FPS on Oculink as it is. However, if we take a look at the differences, my desktop is around 30% better. And obviously, this whole thing changes a bunch because I can support a 4090 through Oculink. And when I get my 7040U, I'm going to add a CPU upgrade as well, and that's going to be able to compensate against my 5900X. So this is one of the main reasons why I've largely left my desktop. All right, up next, this is 4K, the ultimate quality preset. Again, no upscaling whatsoever for Horizon Zero Dawn. And this is between my 5900X and my 6800U and Oculink, and this is what it looks like. For averages, we're looking about 20% better on versus my desktop. 1 percentile low, my desktop is around 31% better, and 0.2 percentile is 50% better. This is one game where it's pretty interesting to see how CPU bound we are, even at these high-end settings. This is one area where my CPU is just able to really pull ahead a lot. And when we go to 1080p settings, it's pretty much the same story, just more exaggerated. This is an area where my CPU is able to greatly outpace the CPU on my 6800U. Again, I'm just power starved on my 6800U, so I'm not able to upclock or up frequency as much as I can on my desktop. As a result, we can see that averages are 64% better on my desktop, 67% better for 1 percentile lows, that's huge, and 68% better on 0.2 percentile. So this is one game that even when we're trying to like manufacture a GPU bound scenario, it doesn't really matter. The CPU is pretty intense. It's needed quite a bit for Horizon Zero Dawn. All right, so for this next test, it is the Extreme preset. Again, no upscaling and no ray tracing and no Nvidiaworks for Metro Exodus. This is, again, 4K between desktop 5900X versus Oculink 6800U. Again, we're just trying to create a very GPU-bound scenario here. And what we can see is that our averages are around 15% better on desktop. Our 1 percentile is 20% better, and 0.2 percentile is 27% better. Honestly, these results are pretty good considering. These are still not as good as some of the earlier tests that we saw where we were a little bit more in line with what was going on, but still very respectable. Let's go ahead and take a look at 1080p. And here with 1080p, we can see that as a baseline, averages around 17% better on my desktop. For 1 percentile, it's 31% better and 33% better for 0.2 percentile. Those are where you're going to really start feeling it. And even though that's not really a massive difference with these particular extreme settings for Metro Exodus, we're still sub 60 FPS on 1 percentile lows and 0.2 percentile. So even on my desktop and laptop, both of these are not really ideal situations at all. So you really have to lower resolution, lower settings at this particular point in time, or lower resolution, use upscaling of some sort at this particular point in time just to get better performance. Next up, we're taking a look at Red Dead Redemption 2. This is ultra settings. We are using no upscaling whatsoever here once again. And if we take a look at our averages, we're looking at 10% better on against my desktop versus Oculink, around 12% better on 1% lows, and 23% better for 0.2 percentile. But overall, it's still really respectable for what Oculink is doing here versus my desktop. Let's go ahead and take a look at 1080p. All right, so in 1080p, we can see that our averages, we're still 10% only better on desktop. That's actually pretty decent, but then we take a look at 1% lows, we're at 27% better on my desktop and 50% better on 0.2 percentile. So again, this is one area where you're really going to start seeing those CPU differences, but even still, even considering, we're actually doing really well here on Oculink. This is actually pretty good comparison. And for the final test here, this is for The Last of Us Part 1. This is the latest version 1.0.4.1. I am using the Ultra preset. There is no upscaling. And if we take a look at our averages, again, we're around 10% better on desktop for averages, 13% better on 1 percentile, and 15%, 16% better on 0.2 percentile. So again, very GPU bound. Look at this, and really there isn't that much of a difference between desktop and Oculink. For the most part, Oculink has been doing a fantastic job when we're really trying to stress max settings. If you were trying to, obviously none of these settings are really good for frame rate. However, at this particular point in time, I would say that a 3090 is not good for these particular settings. I do run a 4090, and the same situation happens, right? We're still about 10% less via Oculink versus on desktop. And then here it is again with 1080p settings. And this is an area where my desktop is just really pulling ahead. Our averages are 37% better on desktop, 47% better, 48% better for 1 percentile, and 68% better on 2 percentile. All right, so now that we're done looking at all the benchmarks, I wanted to give you a clear understanding of what you're going to be getting into when you're looking at a OneDock solution, when all factors are as simple as they possibly can be, while we're also trying to push as much power as we can into our laptop, like the 6800U at 35 watt, which is a reasonable wattage for a 6800U. So when we take a look at that and we take a look at GPU bound scenarios, we can see that on desktop to Oculink, we're really only losing about 10%. And this is true not even of the 3090, but it's also true of the 4090. Now, you can also use Thunderbolt on the OneDock itself. Now, the only thing I want to say here is that Thunderbolt is going to give you the least performance of the bunch. However, it is the most convenient. The nice thing about the OneDock is it has both solutions, and it's plug and play. You plug in Oculink, don't have anything in Thunderbolt, and it goes out via Oculink. Unplug Oculink, plug in Thunderbolt, it goes out via Thunderbolt. It's so simple to use that it's really, really good. And the Thunderbolt compatibility is better than any name brand thing that I've had. Granted, I've only tried 4 different eGPU solutions. Razer Chroma, I've had no luck with. Sonnet's eGPU, I have had some luck with, but it only worked on my WinMax 2. It didn't work on my Win 4 or my Ioneo 2. This OneDock, Thunderbolt works with Ioneo 2, Win 4, and WinMax 2. So even though I haven't tested a bunch of eGPU solutions, and AMD's Thunderbolt implementation is its own implementation. What I heard is that it's a lot more strict, and HandTalker does a better job with handling that on the Thunderbolt side. So if you were looking for something that did Thunderbolt very well, I could recommend this device a bunch. It just does a lot. It's super versatile, super small. Having it on your desk looks really, really nice. The bad sides to it is that if you were going to only use an external power supply by itself, if you were going to use Thunderbolt, you should have a GPU that is basically limited to using 200 watts. If you were going to use Oculink, have a GPU that was basically limited to 250 watts. And inside of both of those zones, you're going to have a really stable time. So with that caveat out of the way, if that still satisfies you, then the only negative that I would honestly say about the OneDock is that it's a little bit loud. And I've only used the default fans in here. I was sent additional fans, so I don't know how much quieter that gets. But my concern is the default fans that are in here are already cooling everything off, and that has been vetted for what it's doing, especially because I'm pushing so much power through this particular OneDock. I wasn't really comfortable using additional fans if they were quieter because I was concerned if they were not going to be pushing as much air. So that's the only thing that I would say is a negative for the OneDock, is that it's a little bit loud. And that's pretty much the only negative thing I have to say about the OneDock. Otherwise, super sexy, versatile Oculink and Thunderbolt, and works without a hitch. Works better than name brand stuff. Really can't say enough good things about the OneDock eGPU solution. If you're interested in buying the OneDock, it doesn't have a lot of sales numbers, so the best way to, doesn't have a lot of volume, that is to say. It's not going to be mass produced. The best way to get about getting one is to join the sales list, and you're going to be doing that in the GPD Discord below. There's going to be a link below. You'll be able to talk to HandTalker directly and ask him any particular questions that you have with regard to how you can join that list to purchase this if you are interested in it. That's it for this particular video. As always, guys, thank you for your time, and thanks for watching.